Picture an ordinary weekday from the middle of the 20th century. Not a headline moment, not a crisis, just a normal day. A father finishes lunch with a beer, wipes his hands, and drives back to work. A mother lights a cigarette while waiting in a hospital lobby. Children spill out into the street after school, riding bikes with no helmets, no supervision, and no real plan beyond being home by dinner. Doors stay unlocked. Smoke hangs in the air everywhere. Rules exist, but they're loose, informal, and often ignored. To our modern eyes, this feels reckless, even shocking. It's tempting to ask how anyone thought this was acceptable, but that question misses the entire point. The people living this way weren't careless or ignorant. They were operating under a completely different set of assumptions about risk, responsibility, and trust. What feels unthinkable to us today once felt ordinary, practical, even sensible. Not because people didn't value safety, but because they defined it in a completely different way. This story isn't about mocking the past or glorifying it. It's about understanding how quickly our idea of normal can change, and why the world we live in now was shaped by lessons that were learned the hard way. To understand why so many everyday habits from the mid-20th century feel so unsettling today, you have to step into the mindset of the era that followed World War II. This was a time of incredible confidence and forward momentum. Factories were booming, suburbs were expanding, and families truly believed they were building a safer, better world for the next generation. Progress felt inevitable. But government regulation hadn't yet caught up with daily life. Many of the safety rules we now take for granted simply didn't exist, or they were very lightly enforced. Instead, responsibility rested almost entirely on individuals and their communities. People trusted their own judgment, they trusted their neighbors, and they trusted that most problems could be handled informally if they ever came up. Scientific understanding was also incomplete, to say the least. The long-term dangers of second-hand smoke, lead exposure from paint and gasoline, asbestos fibers in insulation, and chemical waste were either completely unknown or widely underestimated. Without clear evidence or public awareness campaigns, there was very little pressure to change these long-standing habits. Convenience often outweighed caution, not because people were indifferent, but because the risks were completely invisible. Think about it. If you can't see it, smell it, or feel it doing immediate harm, it's easy to assume it's harmless. So where did the safety net come from? It came from the community. In the absence of strict regulations, strong community ties filled the gaps. Neighbors watched each other's children play outside, knowing who belonged on the street and who didn't. Shopkeepers knew entire families by name and would extend credit based on a handshake. Teachers, police officers, and local business owners operated with a broad sense of social authority and personal discretion. Order was maintained through familiarity, through knowing the people around you, rather than through formal systems and rule books. When you look back through a modern lens, it's easy to judge these practices harshly. But this story isn't about condemning the past or pretending it was some kind of golden age. It's about recognizing that social norms evolve in response to experience. Every warning label on a product, every safety law we follow, and every restriction now in place was shaped by accidents, illnesses, lawsuits, and hard-earned lessons. The world didn't just change overnight. It shifted gradually as scientific knowledge grew and the consequences of past behaviors became absolutely impossible to ignore. Understanding that process helps explain not only how we got to where we are today, but also why so many once ordinary behaviors now feel completely and totally unimaginable. Now let's talk about one of the most jarring examples: the road. In the middle of the 20th century, the road was a place governed more by instinct and social custom than by law. Driving was becoming widespread, but the culture surrounding it was still incredibly young. Cars were powerful symbols of freedom and independence, not the tightly regulated machines wrapped in safety systems and legal requirements that we know today. For example, having a few drinks before driving home from lunch or the local tavern was rarely questioned. It didn't automatically disqualify someone from getting behind the wheel. Police officers relied more on their own observation than on scientific measurements. If you could walk a straight line and speak clearly, that was often good enough. The concepts of blood alcohol limits, breathalyzers, and zero-tolerance messaging all belonged to a distant future. At the time, responsibility was simply assumed, not forensically tested. Inside the car, safety was informal at best. Seat belts were very uncommon, and when they did start to appear, many people viewed them as an unnecessary hassle, or even believed they were dangerous, trapping you in a crash. Children moved freely between seats, perched on armrests, or even stood up to look out through the windshield. On long trips, a parent's arm stretched across the passenger seat during a sudden stop was considered adequate protection. And outside the car, the rules were even looser. In rural towns and small communities, it was completely normal for children to ride in the open beds of pickup trucks, sitting on the cool metal or wooden planks as the wind rushed past. This wasn't seen as some daredevil act. It was just how you got from the farm to town. The road felt familiar, speeds were generally slower, and most drivers knew one another by sight. Even the way we handled insurance followed this same logic. In many places, carrying car insurance wasn't strictly required unless you got into an accident. Plenty of drivers believed their own careful habits were enough protection. If you'd gone years without an accident, why pay for a policy you might never need? You were rarely asked for proof of insurance unless there was damage that needed to be explained, and it wasn't just cars. Farm equipment shared the road without any of the warning signs or reflective emblems we see today. Tractors would just roll into town at their own slow pace, sometimes with kids riding along on the fenders, the sound and smoke of their diesel engines announcing their presence long before you saw them. Other drivers just slowed down and waited patiently. From our modern perspective, this all sounds like complete chaos. But at the time, it made sense within a world that was built on personal trust, community familiarity, and individual judgment. Traffic was lighter, communities were smaller, and danger, when it did appear, was seen as an unfortunate random exception, not a systemic problem that was just waiting to be regulated. Looking back, it's clear that this version of normal had a hidden cost. The invisible risks eventually became visible, tallied in accident reports, hospital records, and heartbreaking personal stories. The belief in personal judgment began to fade as the evidence mounted that even good people make bad decisions. The informal trust that held communities together couldn't compete with the realities of a faster, more anonymous, and more complex world. The shift was slow, but it was decisive. Public awareness campaigns, like those from Mothers Against Drunk Driving, dramatically changed the conversation around drinking and driving. Horrifying crash test footage made seatbelts and child safety seats non-negotiable. Lawsuits held companies accountable for dangerous products, and new laws were passed to prevent future harm. Each new rule, each new piece of safety gear, and each new warning label is a scar left by a past tragedy. It's a lesson learned. We traded a certain kind of freedom for a different kind of security. We replaced personal discretion with standardized rules and informal trust with legal enforcement. So when we look back at these old photos and films and feel a sense of unease, we're not just judging the past. We are seeing the ghost of a world before the consequences were fully understood. It's a powerful reminder that our own definition of normal is not permanent. It's a work in progress, constantly being reshaped by new knowledge, new technologies, and the hard-won wisdom of those who came before us. What seems perfectly safe and normal to us today might just look shockingly reckless to the generations of tomorrow. Thanks for watching. If you found this look into the past interesting, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories about how our world has changed. See you next time. For much of the mid-20th century, smoke wasn't just tolerated, it was woven into the fabric of public life. Cigarettes were advertised as calming, sophisticated, even healthy. Doctors endorsed them, movie stars glamorized them, and nearly every indoor space carried a faint blue haze as a matter of course. Hospitals, of all places, were no exception. Patients waited for appointments with cigarettes in hand, ashtrays resting on side tables beneath fluorescent lights. Nurses and doctors moved through the smoke without comment. The smell of disinfectant mixed with coffee and tobacco was so familiar that it barely registered. The idea that smoke could harm anyone nearby simply wasn't part of the conversation yet. Air travel followed the same logic. Airplanes were designed with smoking in mind, complete with ashtrays built into armrests. Flight attendants offered matches as casually as they poured coffee. Whether you were seated up front or in the cheapest row, lighting up was part of passing the time in the air. The cabin haze was accepted as part of the experience, no more remarkable than engine noise or turbulence. On the ground, smoking extended into offices, stores, elevators, and movie theaters. Clerks rang up purchases with cigarettes balanced between their fingers. Teachers smoked in staff rooms and sometimes classrooms. In theaters, the beam of the projector cut through swirling smoke, giving the air a dreamlike quality. Ashtrays were built directly into seat backs, as permanent as the fabric upholstery. Children grew up surrounded by it. Sending a kid to the corner store to buy cigarettes was common enough to raise no eyebrows. Some shops enforced age rules loosely, others not at all. Cigarette vending machines stood in diners and bowling alleys, accessible to anyone with spare change. Even novelty items like candy cigarettes reinforced the idea that smoking was normal, harmless, and grown-up. What is striking isn't just how widespread smoking was. It is how unquestioned it remained for so long. The science linking tobacco to long-term illness existed in fragments, but it hadn't yet reshaped public behavior. Without clear warnings or visible consequences, society treated smoke as a social habit, not a public health threat. Only later, as evidence mounted and attitudes shifted, did these spaces begin to clear. But for decades, smoke wasn't something you avoided. It was simply part of the air you breathed.